Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mohammed, and I am a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. I would like to welcome you all to this session of the second round of the Arab Graduate Student Conference, which is being held online until tomorrow. I would like to welcome Elias Issam Ghazal, our main speaker, who is going to present a paper on sectarianism. Elias is a PhD student in international relations at Lancaster University, UK. He is also a PhD fellow at the Sectarianism Process and Desectarianization Project at the Richardson Institute in UK. He assisted in teaching politics and international relations for undergraduate students and co-taught a graduate course in history, politics, and economics of the MENA region. He has authored several articles for various academic websites and is currently co-editing a book on sectarianism in the contemporary Middle East. And I would like to welcome Dr. Morten Valbjorn, who is going to be our participant discussant in this session. And before I pass on to Elias, let me remind our Zoom participants that they can take part in the discussion after raising hands. And as to our audience on social media, you can certainly submit your questions and feedback as comments, and we will take them during the Q&A session that follows. So Elias is going to present a paper on sectarianism, as I said. The full title of the paper is Religious Leaders, Sectarianism and Protests in Lebanon. Welcome, Elias. You have 20 to 25 minutes, maximum 30 minutes to present your paper. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and thank you for the center, for the Arab Center, for this opportunity, and for my colleagues to be who are here to share with me and give me their thoughts and input on this. And I'm happy to be sharing this paper, which is inspired by my dissertation. So I'm just gonna take a minute to set up my share screen. So my paper is on religious leaders, sectarianism and desectarization in Lebanon. And as a background to this, and more about what I'm trying to hope from the study is, this emanates from seeing or observing how religious identity has become to play, or has always maybe played a pivotal role in national and state building. And here we see examples of this on both sides of the spectrum. On one side, we see states that have accepted or have adopted a certain religious ideology and have made it the center of its authority and its institution, and have in some places sought to export that and propagate it. And on the other side, we see also examples of states that have set themselves up as anti-religious or as secular or as post-religious in some cases. And in between, you have this whole wide range of cases where religious identity plays a somewhat of a elusive role in this. But nonetheless, there's a little disagreement that religious identity plays a key role in this. And behind that, and behind every religious identity, there are key actors that drive forward this ideology. We refer to them as religious leaders, but in each religion they have their own sort of nomenclature. So it could be the clergy, it could be the bishops or sheikh or ulama or amamat. They come in different names and different titles, and they have different functionality. But they are key actors in this because they manufacture the religious ideology. Their training in hermeneutics, the explanation of sacred scripture, their ability to reach out to people of their community, all these factors come together to put them in what Peter Haas calls epistemological community. They are thought leaders in that area. They're organized. They have some sort of guild that binds them together, and they shape opinions and influence. And states have learned how to deal with these groups in different ways. They either try and suppress them and shun them, or they try and coerce them and get them to give them and bestow legitimacy on them. And in the Middle East, we've had a number of cases where religious leaders have been a cause for diplomatic tension. For example, in the case of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, and how his execution caused a lot of uproar and tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yusuf al-Qaradawi is another example. Leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, was also characterized as a divisive figure. Some states called him as propagating or advancing terrorism, or marketing or promoting terrorism. And it's in other contexts, in Turkey, in the Turkish context, Pastor Andrew was imprisoned and had led to the involvement of US to intervene and try to release him. And that also rocked the diplomatic relations between the two states. So there are many cases. There are a lot of work. There are a lot of emphasis on religious actors as key actors in diplomatic relations and what they can do to state relations. But often the literature presents these religious actors, and I'll just call them religious actors for simplicity here, presents them as always sort of part of the problem. They're always the one that are instigating division. They are always the one that are part of the chaos. They serve fluid interests. But what I want to shed light on is, what is the capacity of these religious leaders to act as, in my case, these sectarianizing agents, or generally to be part of the solution? Do they have? Can we approach them? Can we look at them as actors that can help us to move beyond the deadlock that we're in, or the tension that surrounds religious identity? And I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by these sectarianization agents when I talk about theoretical framework and how that plays out. So the underlying premise to my paper and my thesis is that sectarianism is constructed. Much has been written about this to say, we need to move beyond this debate between whether it's primordialist or instrumentalist. And this is what I'm picking up on, and to say that it is constructed, it builds on some divisions, some cleavages that have some religious ideological tension between them, but they're also been instrumentalized and used in context-specific areas for regimes or for authorities to advance their power or to entrench themselves in power. So the debate has been, I think, well established, and I'm picking up on that. In addition, I'm intersecting this with the work that is done on securitization and sectarianization. Securitization is the work of the Copenhagen School that frames security as a verbal act, as you bring something into a security dialogue by framing it as an existential threat. And by doing so, you are asking the audience, a target audience, to grant you permission to act in extraordinary ways. And often that has meant to intervene with force, with violence, or coercion. And securitization is not only about military securitization and casting a certain one as a military threat, but it could be at the societal level. And here I see work done in sectarianization work by Hashemi and Postal helpful, because they work with these concepts and say that authoritarian regimes in the Middle East have sectarianized, have used sectarian identity or have sectarianized politics in ways to make them to remain in power and to weaken the other, and by casting a sectarian community as an existential threat to national security. Securitization and sectarianization actors have different components. They look at facilitating conditions, or the actors themselves, the audience, and different ways of evaluating that. What I think is helpful when discussing, sectarianism and the desectarianization or the move beyond sectarianism, I think it's important to focus on actors as the unit of analysis, because we are every sectarian act or sectarianization act has an actor, and so it's important to, when trying to push towards certain concept or towards certain state, to try and work with these actors and see what they can do. So sectarianizing actors could be states or non-states, and this helps us in analyzing and narrowing the facilitating conditions that we need to permit or create to make sectarianization or desectarianization helpful. So what does this say about desectarianization? So desectarianization in simple terms is the reversal of the sectarianization process. It's the process that moves towards a state where sectarian identity is not divisive. It sees an imagined desectarianized state and tries to work towards that. It does not. It seeks to depoliticize basically sectarian identity. It doesn't say anything about the inherent nature of sectarian identity. It's not evil. It's not naturally occurring. It's not divisive by nature. It doesn't make any statements on that. Rather, what it tries to do is it tries to create conditions that make the sort of manipulation of sectarian identity ineffective. So rather than working on sectarian identity itself, it works on the conditions that permit sectarianization. To try and make the sense of this, I'll put this in the context of Lebanon and then bring it to religious leaders. So in Lebanon, Lebanon has struggled with sectarian problems, sectarian identity from before its independence. At the times of the Ottomans, in the formation of the structure of governance, whether it's the double maqa'imatain or the mutasarrifiyya, sectarian identity has always been a key factor in dividing power and control. In the independence period or in the pre-independence period, under the French mandate, it paved the way for this system of consociationalism that created a power-sharing formula between members of the different sects, Lebanese confessions. And while that was believed or perceived to help bring the different members of society together to the sort of decision-making table and share decisions and work on national interest, it eventually over time led to division and chaos, and in 1975 erupted into war. Because what that ended up happening is that each community thought about how to serve its own interests, its own zu'ama, and its own leaders, saw the state as a provider of resources and tried to possess or usurp as much as they could from the state. After the Civil War, the formula of the power sharing formula was adjusted a little bit, again with the conception that this is a good formula, but it hasn't been applied well. Nonetheless, the Taif Accords in included in its clause, several clauses to say that sectarianism should be terminated. There needs to be an end to sectarianism. That by the first election after the Ta'if, after 1990, there should be a commission formed to try and move beyond sectarianism. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. On the contrary, what happened is we see sectarian leaders who were, a decade before fighting each other in conflict are now on the, in power together, working in a muhasasa formula, trying to split state resources for their advancement. It is evident from this and from the brief history of Lebanon that to see that sectarianism is institutionalized. There are different positions within the state that are reserved for particular confessional communities. The governments that are formed in the last few years, national unity government, have basically meant that you get all the different actors, all the dominant leaders in the government or on the Lebanese landscape, and you give them an opportunity to work together a solution that works for everybody. And often what ends up happening is that these solutions, they can't work on a formula. So the situation deteriorates, or you end up, dropping the government and causing for different elections. And so from there, it might seem like, desectarianization is somewhat is a difficult or insurmountable task. And that, the more that we spend, in this system, the more sectarianism is entrenched, is deeply rooted, it's difficult to uproot. And to counter that, I would like to propose that desectarianization in this context, desectarianization as the drive, the process that seeks to move from sectarian identity being pivotal in ordering public life to it being an important but not pivotal. That process is not a one-time event that happens and then it has its ramifications. Rather, it's a continuum. It is something that takes time. It is complex. It is protracted. We don't always feel or see its outcome immediately, but rather it is something that paves the way for different dynamics as a result of this successive desectarianization efforts. And it's possible to see this by looking at different milestones in the history of Lebanon post-Ta'if. In 1997, there was a revolution of the Hungary led by former Hezbollah Secretary General Lطيفي. Even though it was primarily Shia, but it had called for an end to this politicization of their identity and its use for political gains. And in it, we see the sort of the early seeds of a desectarianization movement. 2005, after the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, we saw the outbreak of the Cedar Revolution, which was unparalleled in Lebanese history to see so many cross-sectarian groups come together and chanting calls for an end to sectarianism, Muslims and Christians, Shia and Sunni coming together and calling for an end to sectarian politicking. Unfortunately, that didn't materialize in the immediate period, but that wasn't the end of the drive or the momentum for desectarianization. In after 2011, when the Arab uprisings became contagious and when the wave reached Lebanon, there were several groups that again tried to revive the drive for desectarianization. And here I want to point out that between 2005 and 2011, several desectarianization acts materialized in the formation of NGOs and political groups that before then weren't present, but have entered the political scene and had tried to make a difference by offering people an option to vote and to work with solid or hardcore sectarian groups, the traditional parties and the Zu'ama and the warlord groups. In the Arab uprising, there was another sort of push to try and bring that into fruition. And again, we saw some more sort of a new generation of people, new generation of Lebanese calling for these desectarianization of Lebanese politics and the system. In 2015, there was the garbage crisis, the national unity governments that had formed, this power sharing formula that presumably was there to spare Lebanon conflicts and violence between its members was proving itself to be incapable of governing in an efficient way. The used thing, the garbage crisis that left trash heaps throughout the cities of Beirut demonstrated that and built bigger momentum for desectarianization. Finally, and more recently, it was the 2019 October 17 revolutions in Lebanon. There it was erupted. Yes, it was ignited by the attacks on the WhatsApp call, but we saw more fervor and more action and more groups coalescing and working together to pave the way for desectarianizing Lebanon. So this provides sort of a brief overview of how we see desectarianization as a projectile that's working towards a desectarianized imagined state. It's not about whether it's going to happen now or in 5 years. That's we can't predict that, but there is a momentum and a push in that direction. So what do Shia ulama and the religious leaders have to do with this? I say Shia because that's the group I'm focusing on in this paper and my dissertation. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the Shia in Lebanon have somewhat of a sort of a unique history in a short period of time. For a long time, they were, deprived, dispossessed, disenfranchised. And within a short period, the relatively short period, they were organized, they were politicized, they became very active, and now they're one of the largest numerically, but also most organized groups in Lebanon. And the history of Shia in Lebanon, in that context, there were two key actors that were key in giving the Shia community this political identity. And it's Musa Sadr and Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah. Musa Sadr, of Lebanese origin, was living in Iran but came to Lebanon in the early 60s, and he made such a huge influence on the community in that he sought to give them a political voice. Musa Sadr was a big believer in the power sharing system. He saw diversity as enriching to Lebanon, but the way it was practiced was abhorrent to him. And rather than try to throw the sectarian power sharing system out of the window, he sought to reform it. He made many efforts. He spoke against the Zu'ama who manipulated their constituents for their votes, who tried and usurped more power to themselves. He called them out, but because of circumstances, Musa Sadr was detracted from this mission. He formed the Amal, Afwaj al-Muqawama al-Lebaniyya, to combat the Israeli aggression on South Lebanon. And later on, he was kidnapped and not to be seen. And that project was presumably passed over to his successor, Nabih Birri, but we haven't seen any push in that direction since Musa Sadr. The other key character in this is Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah. Fadlallah also descends from a Lebanese origin family, studied in Qom, and eventually became a marja taqlid, which is very important in Shia ideology, because every practicing Shia Muslim is to emulate a specific taqlid, marja taqlid. And Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah became at one point the wakil, the representative, or the marja taqlid al-Khuwi and later he himself ascended to become a marja taqlid himself, a Lebanese marja taqlid, which is very significant. And Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, he saw he was a contemporary of Musa Sadr, and he saw how he dealt with mobilizing people and trying to organize them to demand political rights and so on and so forth. But he saw how that ended, especially during the Lebanese war. And to him, he tolerated the power sharing system, but he believed in a more sort of a holistic version of Islam. And by that I mean he didn't see himself just as a Shia figure. He believed that he was a representative and a leader for the entire Muslim community, and that what he has to offer was not just beneficial to Muslims, but also to Christians and everybody, at least in the Lebanese context. He was very influential over the ideology of Hezbollah, even though he tried to later on to distance himself from that. So here we see an example of two Shia leading figures who are very influential in Lebanon, and both of them, and theoretically and even in the rhetoric, try to bring an end to sectarianism by shunning it or by discrediting it, and by proposing an alternative to it in different ways. I think this points to a direction on modern attempts to desectarianize, and opens the space for contemporary and current Shia leaders and clergy in general, but by being specific to try and be focused in seeking to depoliticize their Shiite identity. They have the capacity as community gatekeepers, as trusted leaders of their community. They have the capacity to influence their opinion about that. And here I'm not talking about the top tier, the highest elitist clergy. I'm talking about the grassroots movement and the real leaders that are there, that are seeing how they have a foot in both worlds and can understand what their religion teaches, and can see how some political leaders are manipulating that. They have an ability to speak to that and point to a direction where that's not the case, or that these two worlds don't intersect in a way that serves the country, or that serves the country.
Yes.
And there are a number.
Yes, sorry for the interruption. You have 5-6 minutes to finish. Okay.
I'll wrap it up. And we already see examples of that in Lebanon. We have Muhammad al-Hajj al-Amili. We have Sheikh Jawad forgot his last name, from Baalbek. Sheikh Yasser from Dahi. A number of Shia clerics that are Subh al-Tufaili as well. A number of Shia clerics that have been coming out and speaking out against this sectarian system. They are speaking against how parties and certain groups are taking advantage of that, and they're being opposed. Obviously, they're being accused of being Shiite Safarat, Shiites of the embassies, that they're being a fifth column. There's a counter movement against them. Nonetheless, I think they have a capacity to do what civil society and non-religious actors can do, being uniquely positioned in both worlds, the religious world and the political world, or with influence over people who are politicized because of sectarian culture. They can make a big difference toward desectarianization. And I hope I can expand on this further in my dissertation and hopefully see it in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias, for the excellent presentation, I think. Now I pass on to Dr. Morten, who is going to give us some feedback on the paper. Before I pass on to you, Morten, let me introduce you. Morten is an associate professor of political science at Aarhus University. I wish my Danish pronunciation is correct.
It's excellent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Morten holds a PhD degree from Aarhus University in Denmark, and he has published a number of research papers in established international journals and edited volumes. His research interests are Middle East Islamism before and after 2011, and sectarian politics before, during, and after 2011. So, Morten, you are from the heartland of securitization theory. So we are looking forward for your feedback. Please.
Thank you. And as I'm from Aarhus and not Copenhagen, I would, of course, emphasize that this securitization theory is a Copenhagen thing, not us from Aarhus. So we can have some sectarian politics in Denmark as for competition between Aarhus and Copenhagen. But Elias, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. You did a real good job. I enjoyed very much the presentation. And I think also that in the presentation you actually addressed some of the issues I'm going to speak a bit about based on my reading of the paper, because my comments relates to the paper, and your presentation to some extent expanded a bit on some of the arguments you made in the paper, but I have prepared my comments on the paper. And the paper is it addresses a very important and interesting topic. It is well written. It shows that you are well read, that you know the relevant literatures, debates. So that is excellent. And of course, I do also have some comments and suggestions and ideas relating to the paper. And I have divided my comments into 4 clusters. The first relates to the framing, the style, the structure of the paper. The second, as for to what extent you are making argument for the choices you are making. The third relates to your concepts and the theories, and then I have some minor specific issues. So these are my 4 clusters I'm going to talk a bit about. As for the first cluster, the cluster about the framing, style, and structure of the paper, I would say that I'm not really, because this paper is part of your PhD project, so I'm not aware if you intend to, if the ambition is to make it into an article, or if it's written mainly for this event, and then you have the long version in terms of the PhD. Because I would say my first point as for the first cluster would be that I would say it needs a bit of restructuring, because as the paper stands, you are in a way making a very long introduction to what you actually aim to do. That you actually get to what you are really interested in, the role of religious actors at page 789, out of which is at the very end of the paper. So the balance in my view is a bit wrong in the sense that you are making a lot of warm-up, and then you don't have time space for what you are really interested in. But maybe that arrives in your PhD dissertation, and I'm looking very much forward to read that and follow it. And just as a specific remark, at the middle of page 7, actually there you the kind of discussion you have there on why it is interesting to focus at religious actors and so on and so forth. Actually, I would move that paragraph or that section to the very introduction, in order to let the reader understand why this is an important topic, which it is. And another point as for the framing, style, structure of the paper is also, I need a bit more help as for that you are taking me in your hand as for when I'm going through, when I read the paper, and you explain to me what am I going to read about now, and after a section, I would like you to highlight for me what are the important major findings, takeaway points, this kind of the so what question. For instance, you have a long section on Lebanon and also one about Sadra and Fadlala, and there it would be useful if you added a paragraph after each of these sections, highlighting, okay, what are the main findings? What is it important to get? What are the lessons from these sections? Then, as for the introduction, I think it could also be useful to expand that somewhat more than what you have done, and then develop it a bit more. One is I couldn't find a very clear research question. I do understand what the paper is about, but at least to my taste, it would be useful if you really flag, maybe even in italics, what is your research question in this paper? So it's really clear from the very start for the reader. And then, as my own rule of thumb, what should introduction consist of? There should be an introduction to the topic. There should be a short, brief intro to the state of the art, but also what are the gaps, what are the problems in the existing literature? Why do we need your paper and your dissertation, which we need, but make it the argument why there's a gap in the existing literature which you are filling. And there you could also be more bold in stating your contribution. How do you contribute? And also specify what kind of audience do you want to speak to? Is this a paper which is going to be read by Lebanese specialists, or be read by religious studies figures interested in the role of religious actors, or by scholars interested in the broader sectarianism debate? And then you could also develop what is the puzzle, the problem. And for instance, you do have a puzzle, because often, as you said in your presentation, that religious actors are often associated with being promoters of sectarianism. But what you point is that in principle, they can actually have the opposite role, the role of have a positive role in terms of desectarianization. So religious actors can have different kind of roles, and what you want to examine is also how come they have different kind of roles, and why, how do we understand why some may contribute to sectarianism, why others have the opposite kind of role? That could be the puzzle also in your paper. And then just I think, yeah, then I also need to know, how do you address your question, your methodology, some reflection on what's your research strategy for examining your research question. And then lastly, in the introduction, a roadmap, a short explanation how this paper will be divided into X number of sections, and just a brief roadmap, because that's very useful for the reader when you are then reading your way through the paper. So that was one dimension, the first cluster in my remarks about framing, style, and structure. Then I have this remark, the second cluster of remarks, as for your selection of focus, of foci. And there I would like you to do more in explaining your choices. For instance, why Lebanon? You may have personal reasons for choosing Lebanon. It might be because your thesis is about Lebanon, but it would be useful in this paper that we learn about why are you using, you're addressing a general question about the role of religious actors for desectarianization. But there we could also focus on Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Bahrain or all kind of other places, but we focused on Lebanon. Okay, why that? do you have an argument for why Lebanon is really interesting? And I'm sure you do have. And also, in relation to that, when you then have chosen Lebanon, what are the scope then of your findings? These lessons you may draw from studying Lebanon, can they also be applied elsewhere? For instance, in the Gulf. I have my own view. There's a tendency that much of the last decades of literature and debate about sectarianism often focus on Lebanon for good reason. But there's also a tendency often to generalize about sectarianism based on experiences from Lebanon. And in many ways, Lebanon is a quite special country. The kind of political system and history you find in Lebanon, you do not find that in the Gulf. So maybe the findings can be extremely relevant in a Lebanese context, but maybe of limited relevance in a Gulfi context, for instance. So it would be relevant if you made an argument for why you have chosen this case, why that is useful for your study, and what is the scope. In a similar way, it would be useful if you also make a bold argument. You did it more in your presentation. That was excellent. On why do you focus solely on Shia clerics? What about Sunni Muslim clerics, Christian religious figures, and so on and so forth? And also have a reflection on the findings you have as for on based on these Shia clerics. Can they be transferred also to Christian figures or Sunni figures, or is this special for the Shia setting? Also with the whole system of Shia clerics and so on and so forth, is that special or not? Also, you choose to focus on Musa Sadra and Fadlallah. Why that? On the one hand, you make the argument as for why they have been so important in constituting Shia identity in Lebanon. On the one hand, one could argue that these two figures have passed away. So would it be more interesting to look at some contemporary figures instead? You don't touch upon that in the paper, but you did in the presentation. I think that was really, really interesting. So the point of my second cluster would be about the importance of clarifying your choices. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with your choices, just make a strong argument. Because most often in social science, you can do things in all kinds of ways, but you have to make a decision and making it one rather than other ways, and then just make an argument for why you have chosen to do it in this way rather than other alternative ways. Then the third cluster of comments, as for concepts and theories, the first dimension here is, of course, the concept of desectarianization, which is a rather new concept, but it's also a concept where you find a lot of confusion still. There's a huge confusion as whether one should talk about desectarianization or anti-sectarianism or cross-sectarianism or post-sectarianism and so on and so forth. So it would be useful if you expanded the section in the paper on the debate about desectarianization, that on the one hand, there's agreement that it's about countering sectarianism somehow. But there's a huge disagreement about actually what that implies. For instance, is it to eradicate any kind of sectarian identity that one should not consider him or herself as Shia or Sunni? Or has it more to do with sectarian identity's role in politics? Or has it more to do with hate? Or what is desectarianization actually about? How extreme does it have to be? And then also the whole debate as for the strategies. Some would say that desectarianization would be about eliminating the role of sectarian identities as such. Others would say it's about coexistence. That it's perfectly fine that people can consider themselves as Shia and Sunni and Christian and whatever, but it is about coexisting peacefully. So how do you position yourself in this debate about what desectarization actually is? And I'm sure you are aware of the recent special issue edited by your friend and supervisor Simon Mayburn in the Review of Faith and International Affairs, which addresses some of these issues. And the whole debate about desectarization is also related to the concept of sectarianism, of course, because there's also a huge confusion. It is one of the perfect example of essentially contested concepts. Everyone believes they know what sectarianism is, but it appears that each of us are using the term in our own way, so there's a lot of confusion as for what sectarianism actually is. And if you want to counter sectarianism, then we should also know what we want to counter, actually. And here, it could also be useful if you elaborate a bit more on your view as for what sectarianism is, and also the causes of sectarianism. Because on the one hand, you are stressing how politics, authoritarian regimes, and elites' use of the sectarian card is very important. It's also important about rivalry for scarce resources and so on and so forth. It's perfectly fine. But if it is so, then does religion play any role for sectarianism? And if religion plays a really marginal role when it comes to for sectarianism, why is it then important to focus on religious leaders? Haddad, in his new book, Understanding Sectarianism, points exactly to that some variances of sectarianism has very little to do with religion, and in those cases, calls for interfaith dialogue is not really relevant because it is not about faith. So maybe it's also worthwhile to reflect upon that if you focus on religious leaders, is it because, in your view, sectarianism and religion, that religion matters for sectarianism, or is it just an identity marker similar to ethnic identities? And then when it comes to religious figures, it could also be useful to expand upon your thoughts as for whether religious figures, do they differ from other kind of actors? And also, do different kind of religious figures differ from each other? If it is so that sometimes some religious figures can promote sectarianism, and at other times they can counter sectarianism, is it because there are differences between different kind of religious figures? Is it useful to have a typology of different kinds of religious figures? And then my last cluster is just some minor issues I came across in the paper. At page 1, you are saying that sectarianism can be seen as a threat to a nationalist project. Haddad, in his new book, would argue against that view, pointing to that nationalism does not necessarily have to be in contrast to sectarianism. It can be, but does not have to be. Then you're saying that, also page 1, as sectarianism is about excluding the other from decision-making process, sectarianism is about demonizing the other. Then I'm wondering whether we have any sectarianism in Lebanon, in the sense that the Lebanese system is about including the various representatives, elites representing the various sects in the political system. So there it is not really about excluding, right? So it depends upon what we are talking about. Then also you at page 7 you talk about desectarianism, as whether to what extent sectarianism and poverty is related. You have a discussion about that, and whether desectarization and the alleviation of poverty could be a strategy. And then comes to my mind, what about Gulf countries as Bahrain and Saudi and Kuwait and the like. Is poverty the main driver here for sectarianism, or how? And then my last comment is that you're talking about urban planning. To what extent can urban planning play a role here also for desectarian strategies? And there I will bring your attention to a recent paper by Justin Gengler, where he exactly looks at geography and urban structures as implications for sectarianism, but also desectarization. And my last point, and then I will shut up, is that the question about the role of religious leaders, Courtney Freer has published upon that, and some of her work, for instance, a recent article in British Journal of Middle East Studies might be of interest to you. So those were my comments, but I really enjoyed the paper, and I think it's a really important topic, and it's really important to point out how religious actors can have a different kind of roles when it comes to both sectarianism and desectarianism. That's a very important topic, and I'm looking very much forward to follow your project on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morten, for your valuable and constructive comments, which will certainly influence the final outcome of Elias' research project. Elias, I think I should give you a couple of minutes if you want to reply to the comments of Morten.
Yeah, well, let me start.
Yes.
Yeah, let me start by saying thank you very much, Morten. This is very, very helpful. It reminds me of all the challenges that I was going through when I was trying to put to pen this paper. It started, I'll try to just comment briefly on a few of the things. The structure, it started as a sort of an offshoot paper, but then tried to work it in the dissertation. And I guess that confusion became apparent when you read it out of its context. But definitely all of the points are well taken, and I'll work on them for sure. I understand the reason to be more specific and explain the focus. One of the challenges I had, there are so many sort of things to explain why. So why Lebanon, why Shia, why this case, why, and so on. I see the value of it, why Fadlallah, why Sadr. I see the importance of it. Maybe when I restructure the paper and take away the sections in the front that are sort of maybe more general and try to focus more on the paper, I'll be able to beef up these sections and try to give a proper argument for it. Thank you for the inputs about the concepts and the details about desectarianization. Again, good points all around. I need to integrate these into the paper. I see now that this paper needs a lot of more work than what I had submitted at the beginning. And definitely the points about sectarianism and conceptually it being alienating or demonizing. I see the fully in that now. Thank you. It's very helpful. I'll be sure to work on this and hopefully bring it up to a publishing standard.
Thank you, Elias and Morten, for this interesting exchange. I would like to thank our audience on social media for attending this session. And I would like to remind them